I want to ask about the bailout that you just talked about, because, those of us who've covered politics for a long time, like, we see like these bitter political fights to get these like really small things. Like, there's just like endless debates, fights in the media, and then the CARE package comes out with the bailout package from Congress. There's like zero debate, 15 minutes, trillions of dollars, just kind of goes from one side, or just it's like. What is, like, it's so hard to wrap your mind around it. Like, help us understand what that is. Like, how did they just do that? Like, they could just wipe with the sign of a pen, and all of a sudden, was it $4 or $5 trillion just get funneled into the investor class? Like, how does that work? And because it just feels like it makes me go crazy, because it feels like when we argue about politics, we're arguing about like the crumbs, whereas like the big things, these trillions of dollar decisions just happen, and we have no input, no say, and they take 2 seconds to happen.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And even that CARES Act, which was touted as being $2.3 trillion for people, for the mainstream economy, when you dug into it, as I did, as other reporters did, what you saw was that abundance of sort of quick availability of what was called fiscal stimulus actually had a lot of carve-outs that could be blown up to be monetary stimulus. So for example, part of that package included seed money from the Treasury Department, from us taxpayers, to be given to the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve basically would leverage or multiply it by a lot, and they would be able to go out and buy corporate debt that was already existing in the market and that doesn't even exist yet, which were way beyond the boundaries of what they could do. And that was kind of tucked into the CARES package, as was a lot of corporate subsidies and corporate bailouts that went specifically to companies rather than to the actual employees. Now, yes, it also had the PPP program, which also disproportionately went to larger small businesses and not individual owned businesses. But that was touted as being a big component of that multi-trillion-dollar package, as was the extension of unemployment benefits, which again were necessary and useful for people, but again, a smaller percentage of that package. So the way I look at it is Congress wanted to help their constituents, because they're people, they vote for them. But at the same time, what they really wanted to do is make sure that the larger corporate customers of Congress were filled first. Now, of course, we had a shutdown, and there was a need for liquidity and need for money. But the way in which it was done was, so massive and so disproportionately helpful to the companies at their top levels to do with what they wanted with that money, with no accountability, no strings attached, really, particularly relative to other countries that had different sorts of fiscal packages, that it was really, really momentous, that we even had to watch. In addition to that, fights or little mini squabbles about, sort of minutia on the floors of Congress, or on the sort of virtual communication floors of Congress at the time, was really astounding and ridiculous. And the problem with that is they can turn around and say, look, we did this. We created a multi-trillion-dollar stimulus package. Well, that $2.3 trillion stimulus package, when you consider it all together, was actually a $6.2 trillion package, of which almost $4.5 trillion goes straight to corporations, the Fed, the Wall Street community, the markets, the evidence of which is how easily markets associated with these entities had just, risen, gone back to prior highs. In the case of the NASDAQ, hit new records because of that money flowing into them. So real people, on the other hand, don't have that same take on that money, right? The real economy doesn't jump back in a quarter.
Yeah, we're arguing about Goya beans in the discourse.
I know, it's infuriating. It really is infuriating because, when you look at the larger picture, the way that this type of monetary policy has been sold to average Americans is, well, look, the banks need the liquidity in order to, make these loans to small businesses, to help people maybe refinance their mortgages, those types of things. But there's been absolutely no real follow-up by mainstream journalists on that. And if you do a little digging, you'll find that the banks have actually made it incredibly difficult for the average American to refinance their mortgage, which, by the way, right now could mean the difference between being able to keep their home or getting foreclosed on, right? Because the interest rates have gone down so much. And so do you see this type of monetary policy in any way benefiting either Main Street or average Americans? Does this liquidity benefit anyone other than, people who are invested in the stock market, essentially, investors?
Yeah, I mean, it basically does on the margins, but doesn't really, to answer the main question. And I've talked about this for a long time in different manifestations of monetary policy, none of which have been as just immense in terms of creating this permanent distortion, this dislocation between financial economies and the real economy. And yes, if everyone at any level of the economy that has a mortgage outstanding could be helped by Congress to push these banks to use the generosity that has been bestowed upon them to just refinance everyone without paperwork. Supposedly we went through that, right? Supposedly they're not giving out risky loans anymore like they did before the financial crisis of 2008, right? So they should be more than able to just change the interest rate on their systems and write to everyone or inform everyone that has a loan outstanding, particularly with the banks that received the most amount of allocation from the PPP program as a gift, for which they made about $1.5 billion just in fees, just like in administration fees, to take some of that money and sort of move it to the administration of new mortgage refinancings without people having to go through documents and records and proving that they have income that they don't have because their jobs have been impaired, or they don't have them, or they might not have them. People have had to, when they did go to get refinancings, prove that their job was not affected by the coronavirus pandemic in order to get a refinancing, when they could even get an open channel to even have that conversation. Now, that's not something most people could at the time that the pandemic first hit, or now, or in the foreseeable future, actually be solid about stating. So yes, all of this would have helped the mainstream economy. And it was not done in such a way, when all of this money was sort of given out, as it's still available to banks and so forth, to be able to do this.
And if you were elected dictator of America, how would you have devised you would ban Goya beans, first of all. Yeah. Second of all, what would you have done to deal with the coronavirus pandemic economic, freezing of the economy, essentially?
Yes, so I would have created a way to get that money into the hands of people. If we look at the comparison, for example, to European countries, where instead of floating most of the money to the top levels of corporations, where, as we have seen over the last financial crisis period, it doesn't get to real people. It doesn't really increase wages or enhance employment or benefits or security or anything like that, even though they were shut down. And we got that money directly into the hands of their employees, as opposed to, here it is, if you continue to rehire people, or if you rehire some of them, or if you rehire different ones that are sort of like 2 for 1, or however it is you do it, we'll sort of, forgive a lot of it. I just wouldn't have done that. I would have provided an avenue. I would have required an avenue to go directly to people whose personal economies were shut down in a more devastating way than any of the businesses at the top level of this economy that received the disproportionate amount of benefit. I would have also made all of healthcare in order to be tested, in order to be tested for other types of illnesses outside of our main very bad sort of healthcare system, which in many states was overrun because of the pandemic and could still be overrun in other states as we see other waves or the same wave expanding, or however it is we look at it, to make that accessible as well. Because if you take the possibility of $6 trillion or whatever number you put on just this immense amount of money as a quarter, 20% of the GDP of the United States, which is a significant sum, that there are ways to get it directly into the hands of people. And that wasn't done. I mean, come on, waiting weeks to get a $1,200 check so that President Trump could sign it. That helps nobody pay for their basic necessities. So I wouldn't have to sign the checks either. I think things should have gone out much more quickly. And I would have required any bank that it was in between an individual and this money to not receive fees on this, to have those fees go pass through to those individuals in order for them to get on top of the money they were receiving an extra bit just for the fact that they needed to receive it. And sort of the list goes on from there.